December 22, 1944, 11:30 a.m. A frozen foxhole outside Bastogne, Belgium. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division, sits wrapped in a wool blanket, eating a cold K-ration when his aide rushes in with news. 4 German officers are approaching under a white flag. They're carrying a message from General Heinrich von Leutwitz, commander of the WWII Panzer Corps, an ultimatum demanding immediate surrender. The Germans have surrounded Bastogne. They have tanks, artillery, fresh troops. The Americans are outnumbered, low on ammunition, freezing, and have no hope of immediate relief. Surrender now, the message says, or be annihilated. McAuliffe reads it once, crumples the paper, and utters a single word that will echo through military history: nuts. It's not bravado. It's doctrine, drilled into every American officer since the late 1930s at Fort Benning, Georgia, where a generation of leaders learned that when surrounded, when outnumbered, when the enemy expects you to dig in and pray for rescue, you do the opposite. You attack. This is the story of why American forces became the only army in World War II that consistently counterattacked while encircled, and how that single tactical philosophy changed the course of the war. Fort Benning, Georgia, 1939. In the classrooms and training fields of the U.S. Army Infantry School, a revolution in military thinking is taking shape under the guidance of men like then Major Omar Bradley, then Lieutenant Colonel George C. Marshall, and a cadre of aggressive young officers who have studied the stalemates of World War I and decided that defensive warfare is a death sentence. The conventional wisdom among most armies, European, Soviet, Japanese, is clear. When cut off or surrounded, establish a defensive perimeter, conserve ammunition, hold position, and wait for relief. It's logical, it's safe. It minimizes risk. The British at Dunkirk dug in and prayed for evacuation. Soviet forces, when encircled by German panzers, typically formed hedgehogs, circular defensive positions that held until relieved or annihilated. Even German doctrine, aggressive as it was, viewed encirclement as something to avoid or break out of through retreat, not as an opportunity. But the American doctrine being forged at Fort Benning took a different view, one rooted in aggressive infantry tactics and a uniquely American faith in individual initiative. The core principle was simple but radical: offense is the best defense, even when you're surrounded. If the enemy encircles you, they've stretched their own forces thin to do it. Their supply lines are extended. Their flanks are exposed. They expect you to hunker down and wait to die. So do the opposite: attack outward. Break their momentum. Disrupt their plans. Make them react to you instead of executing their encirclement at leisure. This wasn't reckless aggression. It was calculated aggression based on a hard-eyed assessment of what happened to units that went purely defensive. Static defense in modern warfare, especially against mechanized forces with artillery superiority, was a slow death. You'd run out of ammunition, food, medical supplies. Enemy forces would probe your perimeter, find weak points, concentrate fires, and eventually crack you. Waiting for relief meant gambling that help would arrive before you were overrun. Counterattacking meant taking control of your own fate. The doctrine was built on several key principles that would become hallmarks of American tactical thinking. First, aggressive patrolling and reconnaissance, even when surrounded. Know where the enemy is weak. Find the gaps. Second, combined arms coordination. Use whatever you have: infantry, armor, artillery, air support if available, in coordinated attacks rather than piecemeal defense. Third, decentralized command. Trust junior officers and NCOs to make tactical decisions without waiting for orders from above, because in chaotic encirclement situations, communication is unreliable and speed is everything. Training at Fort Benning reflected this philosophy. Infantry officers were drilled in hasty attack planning, breakthrough tactics, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses. War games and field exercises deliberately put American units in surrounded or cut-off positions and graded them not on how well they held defensive positions, but on how aggressively they counterattacked to break encirclement or disrupt enemy operations. Officers who showed defensive mindsets were counseled to think offensively. The phrase attack, attack, attack became almost a mantra. George C. Marshall, who would become Army Chief of Staff in 1939, was a driving force behind this doctrinal shift. He'd seen the meat grinder of World War I trenches and was determined that American forces would never again sit passively in defensive positions waiting to be ground down by attrition. He believed, correctly, that American industrial capacity and training quality gave U.S. forces advantages that were wasted in static defense but devastating in mobile, aggressive operations. American soldiers might not have the experience of German or Soviet veterans in 1944, but they had initiative, firepower, and a doctrine that encouraged them to use both. By 1941, when the United States entered World War II, this counterattack doctrine was standard teaching across the Army. Young officers like James Gavin, who'd rise to command the 82nd Airborne, Maxwell Taylor, 101st Airborne, and hundreds of others had absorbed it as junior lieutenants at Benning and would carry it with them to battlefields across Europe and the Pacific. It would be tested in Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, but its most dramatic vindication would come in a frozen Belgian town in December 1944, when surrounded paratroopers proved that American doctrine wasn't just theory. December 20th, 1944. The 101st Airborne Division rushed to Bastogne 2 days earlier without proper winter equipment or full ammunition loads, finds itself completely surrounded by elements of 7 German divisions. The situation is textbook encirclement. German forces hold every road in and out of the town. They have numerical superiority, armor superiority, and artillery superiority. By any conventional assessment, the 101st should adopt a defensive posture, dig in, conserve resources, hold the town center, and pray that Patton's Third Army breaks through before the Germans overwhelm them. That's not what happens. From the moment the encirclement becomes clear, Acting Division Commander Anthony McAuliffe, artillery officer by training, now commanding infantry by necessity, begins organizing counterattacks. Not breakout attempts, counterattacks. The distinction is crucial. A breakout is defensive in nature, you're trying to escape. A counterattack is offensive, you're trying to hurt the enemy, disrupt his plans, seize initiative. McAuliffe understands that sitting passively inside Bastogne means letting the Germans concentrate their forces for assault at times and places of their choosing. Counterattacking means forcing the Germans to stay dispersed, to defend their own positions, to react to American moves. The first major counterattack comes on December 20th itself, before the encirclement is even complete. Elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, observing German forces massing for an assault on the eastern perimeter, don't wait to be hit. They attack first, a company-strength assault with tank destroyer support that slams into the German assembly area, kills dozens of enemy troops, destroys several vehicles, and forces the German commander to delay his planned assault while he reorganizes. It's a small action, barely noted in most histories, but it sets the tone for everything that follows. Over the next 2 days, as German forces tighten their grip on Bastogne, the 101st launches attack after attack. Not wild, desperate charges, calculated, limited objective assaults designed to disrupt German operations and seize key terrain. On December 21st, the 502nd Pier counterattacks to recapture the village of Champs, which the Germans had occupied that morning. The assault goes in at dusk with infantry and a handful of Sherman tanks, smashes through German positions, retakes the village, and holds it against counterattacks through the night. The objective isn't just to hold Champs, it's to keep the Germans off balance, to make them worry about their own flanks instead of focusing all energy on crushing Bastogne. Regimental and battalion commanders across the division adopt the same philosophy. When German forces probe the perimeter, American response isn't just defensive fire, it's counterattack. A German patrol approaching from the south gets hit by an immediate infantry assault that drives them back with casualties. A German tank infantry force moving up the road from the east runs into a hasty ambush followed by a flanking attack that destroys 2 tanks and scatters the infantry. The Germans find themselves fighting not against a besieged garrison waiting for rescue, but against an aggressive opponent who attacks every perceived weakness. The American troops, cold and low on supplies, are confused at first, Aren't they supposed to be holding out? Shouldn't they conserve ammunition and energy? But the NCOs and officers trained in the Benying Doctrine push the offensive mindset relentlessly. "We're paratroopers," one company commander tells his men. "We're supposed to be surrounded. Now let's go make the Germans regret it." It's bravado, sure, but it's also doctrine, and it works. German after-action reports from units attacking Bastogne reflect growing frustration. They'd expected to overwhelm a static defense through concentrated assault. Instead, they're dealing with an enemy that seems to attack from different directions simultaneously, that hits back immediately whenever they try to mass forces, that refuses to act like a besieged garrison. A captured German officer, interrogated on December 23rd, tells his interrogators, "We expected you to defend. You kept attacking. It was not what we planned for." That unpreparedness is exactly what the American doctrine exploited. The Germans had seen encirclements before. They'd conducted hundreds of them on the Eastern Front. They knew how encircled units behaved. They went defensive. They waited for relief. They eventually collapsed when supplies ran out or morale broke. But the 101st wasn't following that script. They were writing a new one, and the Germans didn't have a good response. Then on December 22nd, the Germans try psychological warfare, the surrender ultimatum delivered under white flag. It's a standard tactic: offer terms, make surrender seem honorable, break the defender's will. The message to McAuliffe is formal and threatening. The fortune of war is changing. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. McAuliffe reads it, says, "Nuts," and that becomes the formal American reply. But the real answer isn't verbal, it's tactical. Even as the German envoys are being escorted back through American lines, McAuliffe is planning the next counterattack. December 23, 1944. The weather clears. For the first time in days, the cloud cover breaks and American aircraft can fly. C-47 transports drop supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, food into the Bastogne perimeter. Thunderbolts strafe German positions around the town. But the relief from above doesn't change the tactical situation on the ground. The 101st is still surrounded, still outnumbered, and the Germans are preparing for a major assault. McAuliffe's response is to attack first. Not everywhere, resources don't allow that, but at carefully chosen points where intelligence and reconnaissance have identified German weak points or assembly areas. On the evening of December 23rd, as German forces mass on the northwestern perimeter for a dawn assault, elements of the 502nd and 506th Pier launch a coordinated night attack against the German staging area. The assault catches German troops in the open, disrupts their attack preparations, and forces them to pull back and reorganize. The planned German assault is delayed 24 hours, a delay that proves critical because it gives Patton's relief column one more day to advance. These weren't large-scale offensives. The 101st didn't have the strength for that. They were sharp, violent, limited attacks designed for maximum disruption with minimal resource expenditure. A platoon-sized raid against a German artillery position, killing the gun crews and destroying ammunition before withdrawing. A company attack to seize a farmhouse that gave German observers clear views into Bastogne's defenses, followed by fortification and defense of that farmhouse against counterattacks. An armored patrol, 2 or 3 Shermans with infantry support, pushing out beyond the perimeter to ambush German supply trucks on the Bastogne-Wiltz road. Each action, small in itself, created cumulative effects that degraded German combat power and disrupted their timetable. The Germans had to commit forces to guard supply routes that should have been secure. They had to pull units from assault positions to respond to American attacks. They couldn't mass forces for overwhelming assaults because they never knew where the Americans would strike next. The psychological effect was even greater than the material damage. German units began operating more cautiously, hesitating before moving, checking flanks obsessively. The momentum shifted imperceptibly but decisively. German commanders complained in reports that the Americans in Bastogne weren't fighting correctly. They weren't conserving strength for a last stand. They weren't negotiating for terms. They were attacking, constantly, from a position of apparent weakness. It violated German expectations and disrupted German planning. General von Leutwitz, whose ultimatum had been answered with nuts, found his divisions bogged down fighting an opponent who should have been passively defending, but was instead aggressively raiding German positions every night. On Christmas Eve, the 101st launches its largest counterattack of the siege, a battalion-sized assault against the village of Marvy on the southeastern perimeter, which the Germans had occupied and were using as a staging base for attacks into Bastogne. The assault goes in at dawn with armor and artillery support, smashes into the village, and triggers a brutal close-quarters battle that lasts 3 hours. The Americans don't fully retake Marvy. They don't have the strength, but they inflict heavy casualties, destroy German supplies stockpiled there, and force the Germans to commit reinforcements to hold the village instead of using those forces for offensive operations. That same night, December 24, 25, German forces launched their most determined assault of the siege, a major tank infantry attack from the northwest, aimed at the villages of Champs and Hemmerl on the division's western perimeter. It's a powerful attack, Panthers and Panzer IVs supported by Volksgrenadiers, hitting defenses that have been thinned by American casualties and counterattacks. The German armor breaks through the first defensive line and penetrates nearly into Bastogne itself, before being stopped by a desperate defense involving bazookas, artillery firing over open sights, and a handful of tank destroyers. But even as the defense stabilizes, the American response isn't purely defensive. As soon as the German attack loses momentum, tanks destroyed, infantry pinned down by artillery, American forces counterattack the flanks of the penetration. Companies that had been in reserve or holding quiet sectors are shifted immediately to assault positions. They hit the German salient from both sides, isolating the lead German elements, and force a German withdrawal that leaves dozens of vehicles burning and hundreds of German casualties in the snow. By dawn on Christmas Day, the German assault has failed and the perimeter is restored, not through passive defense, but through aggressive counteraction. On December 26th, lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division break through from the south, ending the encirclement. But the narrative that Bastogne was rescued misses the crucial point. The 101st hadn't been sitting passively waiting for rescue. They'd been fighting aggressively, attacking constantly, disrupting German operations so thoroughly that by the time Patton's forces arrived, the German divisions around Bastogne were exhausted, disorganized, and unable to prevent the link-up. The relief was important, but the outcome had been decided by the doctrine that told surrounded Americans to attack rather than wait. The question that troubled Allied and German observers after Bastogne was simple. Why didn't other armies fight like this when surrounded? The British had excellent troops. Why did they typically adopt defensive postures when cut off? The Soviets had proven courage and resilience. Why did their encircled units usually form static hedgehogs? Even the Germans, masters of mobile warfare, typically tried to break out of encirclements rather than attack from within them. What made the American approach different? Part of the answer was doctrinal, rooted in the Fort Benning philosophy that had been drilled into American officers for a decade. But doctrine alone doesn't explain it. Other armies had offensive doctrines too. The deeper answer lay in how American forces were trained, equipped, and commanded at the small unit level. American training emphasized decentralized decision-making to a degree uncommon in other armies. A U.S. infantry company commander or even platoon leader was expected to assess situations and launch attacks on his own initiative, without waiting for orders from battalion or regiment. This was partly necessity. American forces often operated in fluid situations where communication was unreliable, but it was also philosophy. The Army wanted aggressive leaders who would see opportunities and exploit them immediately. When surrounded at Bastogne, that training paid off. Company and platoon leaders launched counterattacks when they saw openings, without waiting for division approval. British forces, by contrast, had a more centralized command culture. Junior officers executed plans developed by higher headquarters. Improvisation was less encouraged. This produced excellent coordination in set-piece battles but less flexibility in chaotic situations. When British units were cut off, as happened at Arnhem during Market Garden, they typically formed tight defensive perimeters and waited for relief according to plan. It wasn't cowardice. It was doctrine and training that emphasized cohesion and coordination over independent action. Soviet doctrine was different but equally ill-suited to aggressive action from encirclement. Soviet units operated under rigid command structures where initiative was discouraged and orders from higher command were absolute. A Soviet officer whose unit was surrounded would establish defense and wait for orders to break out, to hold in place, or to die fighting. The idea of a battalion commander independently launching counterattacks to disrupt enemy operations would have been seen as dangerous insubordination. Soviet courage was never in question. Their soldiers fought with extraordinary tenacity, but the system didn't empower them to act independently the way American doctrine did. Equipment also played a role. American forces had reliable, plentiful radios down to company and sometimes platoon level, enabling coordination of hasty attacks. They had flexible artillery support. At Bastogne, artillery battalions routinely shifted fires to support company-level counterattacks within minutes of request. They had combined arms training that meant infantry, armor, and artillery could work together even in chaotic situations without extensive planning. Other armies had some of these capabilities, but rarely all of them, and rarely pushed down to such low levels of command. There was also a cultural component that's harder to quantify but undeniably present. American military culture valued aggression and initiative in ways that reflected broader American cultural traits. The preference for action over passivity, the belief that offense is better than defense, the faith that individual initiative can overcome systemic disadvantages. These weren't just military doctrines. They were cultural values that American society transmitted to its military. Soldiers and officers believed, often unconsciously, that attacking was what Americans did. Waiting passively for rescue felt un-American. German observations of American forces in late 1944 and 1945 repeatedly note this difference. German after-action reports describe American units that refused to defend passively and counterattack even from disadvantageous positions. One German division commander, captured in early 1945, told interrogators, "Your soldiers are tactically less skilled than ours in defense, but in offense they are relentless. Even when we encircle them, they attack." It's frustrating and difficult to counter. That assessment, less skilled in defense, relentless in offense, captured the American tactical approach perfectly. The Bastogne example spread through the Army as a validation of doctrine. After the battle, the actions of the 101st were studied at service schools, written up in tactical bulletins, and held up as the model of how surrounded units should fight. The message was clear: don't wait for rescue, make the enemy pay for encircling you, attack until relief arrives or the enemy withdraws. It became part of American military identity, the army that counterattacks first. McAuliffe's one-word reply to the German surrender demand, "Nuts," became famous almost immediately. It was perfect, defiant, dismissive, unmistakably American. Newspapers loved it. The home front loved it. Soldiers loved it because it captured the attitude they'd been taught to have. We're surrounded. So what? We're going to fight anyway, and we're going to make you regret cornering us. But the real legacy of Bastogne wasn't the quotable defiance. It was the tactical validation of counterattack doctrine. The 101st Airborne proved that surrounded units could not just survive, but actively degrade enemy forces through aggressive action. They demonstrated that offensive operations from encirclement weren't suicidal desperation, but sound tactics that created operational advantages. And they showed that American training and doctrine, forged in peacetime at places like Fort Benning, could produce battlefield results that confounded enemies who thought they understood how modern war worked. The doctrine persisted beyond World War II. In Korea, American units surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir didn't form defensive perimeters and wait for rescue. They attacked outward, fighting their way through Chinese forces to reach friendly lines. In Vietnam, units that found themselves surrounded or cut off routinely counterattacked to break enemy encirclements rather than adopting purely defensive postures. The expectation that American forces would attack, even from positions of apparent weakness, became baked into how U.S. forces trained and how enemies planned against them. German veterans, interviewed decades after the war, often cited Bastogne as the moment they realized the Americans weren't the inexperienced, unsophisticated opponents they'd faced in North Africa in 1943. At Bastogne, they fought like us, one former Wehrmacht officer said. Aggressive, skilled, refusing to accept defeat. We thought we had them trapped. They thought they had us spread thin. They were right. The counterattack doctrine also influenced post-war American military thinking about nuclear warfare. During the Cold War, NATO planning assumed that if Soviet forces achieved breakthrough and encircled American units, those units would counterattack aggressively rather than wait for relief. The doctrine scaled up. If Soviet armor surrounded an American brigade, that brigade would attack the encirclement rather than defend passively. It was Bastogne writ large. The same principle applied to mechanized warfare against numerically superior forces. Modern U.S. military doctrine still emphasizes offensive action even in defensive situations. The principle that the best defense is a good offense isn't just a cliché. It's embedded in training, planning, and tactical thinking at every level. When American forces find themselves in difficult tactical situations, the institutional instinct is to attack out of them rather than wait for conditions to improve. That's a direct legacy of the doctrine that saved Bastogne and the generation of officers who learned that offense, not defense, wins battles. McAuliffe himself became a symbol of that doctrine. He ended the war as a major general, later rose to 4-star rank, and became Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. But he's remembered not for his post-war career, but for that one moment in a frozen Belgian town when he chose defiance and offense over negotiation and defense. Nuts became shorthand for an entire way of fighting, the American way, forged at Fort Benning, proven at Bastogne, and carried forward into every conflict since. The 101st Airborne Division's insignia, the Screaming Eagle, is still worn with pride by soldiers who may not know all the details of Bastogne but understand what it represents. An army that doesn't wait to be rescued, that attacks when cornered, that turns encirclement into opportunity. That's not just division tradition, it's national military identity, built on the foundation laid by officers in the 1930s who decided that American soldiers would be trained to attack first, always. In the end, Bastogne proved what Fort Benning had theorized, that offense from encirclement isn't desperation, it's doctrine. That counterattacking when surrounded isn't bravado, it's tactics. And that an army trained to think offensively, equipped to act independently, and led by officers who believe in aggressive action will defeat enemies who expect them to sit passively and wait for fate to decide. Other allies took cover first. Americans counterattacked first. At Bastogne, that difference saved a town, broke a German offensive, and validated a doctrine that changed how American forces would fight for generations. McAuliffe's nuts was the memorable moment, but the real story was the 100 small counterattacks, the constant offensive pressure, the refusal to fight the way surrounded units were supposed to fight. That's what won at Bastogne, and that's the legacy that outlasted the battle itself.